This is information.
Hello and welcome to Web Hosting Explained. We're going to talk about the next steps after you get some good code together. After some HTML for content and CSS to style it up, we can start putting it on the web. But what does this actually mean? Let's start with the World Wide Web. It was invented in 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist. Before the World Wide Web, if different people wanted to share information on different computers, you had to actually physically log on to that different computer to get it. But Berners-Lee thought there has to be a better way. Sidebar. Although we now use the terms internet and web interchangeably, they're actually two different things. The global internet is all interconnected networks of computers and hardware devices run by service providers like Comcast or Verizon, governments, individual companies, universities, and others. The internet is the hardware. The web is the information that lives on the internet. End sidebar. So Berners-Lee started working on this better way, and he created HTML. He also created the URL, which is the unique string of words and slashes, the stuff you put in the address bar to go to a web page somewhere on the internet. He called it the Uniform Resource Identifier, but nowadays it's more common to just call it the Uniform Resource Locator, or URL. And he created HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is that first thing you see in the address bar. This is the coding language that allows us to go to a public web page and putting a URL in the address bar, or by clicking hyperlinks. He did all of this and more. Berners-Lee is a real OG. So there's the internet and there's the web. What does that mean for us? If we want to put stuff on the web, we need to start with two things. First, we need space on the internet, the actual hardware stuff, and we need our own URLs, which are usually referred to as domain names when you have to go buy one. This space on the internet, this is what it's called web hosting, because the service will host your HTML and CSS and JavaScript files on their space, and then make them available to anyone who wants to access them. And how do people access them? They use the URL. So how does this really work? First, you buy some web hosting space. There are plenty of decent web hosts out there. In my personal experience, Bluehost is a fine web hosting service with relatively inexpensive prices. Most of the big names like HostGator or DreamHost or InMotion are fine too. What you'll normally start out with is the so-called unlimited storage space on a shared server. A shared server is a lot like a big hard drive that has a few web hosting accounts on it. For most purposes, this is plenty for a small website of a few pages. If you're doing something more excessive, then you may need to pay a little more or use a different service. If you're a bigger entity, maybe you need to spend more to get a dedicated or cloud server or two or more that you have all to yourself. There are all sorts of other bells and whistles and levels to all of this, but right now this is plenty. And once you do have a web host, you usually get something called cPanel to manage your website. This has a bunch of advanced options for doing things with the web hosting, like installing WordPress or any number of content management systems. You can use cPanel as much or as little as you like, and we will revisit cPanel later. Now that we have a web host, the next important thing is domain name, or URL, URI, if you're an OG like B. Lee. This will be the name of your website and the .com, or .org, or .net, or another what is called a top-level domain. Just like with web hosts, there are plenty of decent places to buy domain names from. I personally use namecheap.com. Sidebar. I do recommend buying domain names for a different place from where you get your web hosting. It may sound convenient to have both things come from the same place, but there are better reasons to keep things diversified. One reason is, if you get into a beef with your web host, you can leave and host your website somewhere else. But transferring the domain can be time-consuming, complicated, and confusing. More reasons are further spelled out in this piece from Nuts and Bolts Media, and you should read it. End sidebar. Okay, so now you have a web host and a domain name. What's next? Next is actually uploading your HTML and CSS and images and everything else to the web host. There are two main ways to do this. You can manually upload each file to your web host, which can be a very slow process if you have a lot of files. The better way is to use something called an FTP client, which transfers files all at the same time from your personal computer, also known as local, to the server, sometimes known as remote. Using CyberDuck for Macs or FileZilla for Mac or Windows, you punch in some coordinates, and these FTP clients will transfer those files really fast. And once they get there, this is what you get. On one side, you have your local files, and on the other side, you have an identical set on the remote. The remote files are what show up on the web when you use the address bar, the HTTP or HTTPS, HTTP secure, and the URL. The next thing you'll probably wind up doing is having to update a file on the remote. Going back to CyberDuck or FileZilla, then you can then drag and drop from the local to the remote to overwrite the remote file. Now you can do all of this with CyberDuck or FileZilla or whatever you choose, or you can do this manually with your cPanel, if you're willing to make changes one file at a time.